All right. So I'm looking at my screen here and it doesn't look like it's actually showing the right screen. I'm just going to give it a second to try and catch up. I think it just needs to refresh. It's showing the old image on my end. Okay. All right. I think we're up. Let me just do a really quick mic check. Okay, mic is working. Let's go ahead and get started. So what this is going to cover is basically what's on the Trello. If you don't know what's on the Trello, there's a link in the video description, but ultimately it's a getting started package with Mirror. And I will be using some content for my tutorials, but I'm not going to go as in depth as some of the tutorials, sorry. So if you want to know more about a certain topic, go ahead and check those out. But I will be covering enough so that you can get an idea. If you haven't seen the checklist, it is probably going to change, as in I'm probably going to add more items onto it. Right now, though, I have setting up and installing Mirror, the player motor, spawning player from client instance, events, and more. Network transform, client auth, initializing camera, player name plus UI, has authority, client/server attributes, player animations, also client auth, shooting, both raycast and projectiles, health, so managing player health when they take damage and whatnot, health UI, so that you can see your current health. We got respawning, leaderboard, picking up items. It's not going to be holding items per se, although I do have something that can do that. It's going to be rather running over world items and adding them to your inventory, whatever it might be. In this case, it's going to be pets. So whenever you pick up a pet, it's going to be your AI pet, and that's the next topic, which is AI as your pet, which will attack enemies. And then there's also going to be AI enemies, and very last, probably some game modes, so that behaves a little bit differently depending on the game mode. Like I said, there's always room for improvement, so this is not a set in stone list. I might add on to it as we go. This is also going to be a live stream of everything. Everything's going to be developed live. So there might be, I might make a few mistakes here and there. That's just part of development. I don't think you're going to have to worry about any huge breaking things, because I'm pretty familiar with all this content. But that's just part of development, is you do make mistakes along the way, whether they're big or small. So first thing I'm going to do is search Mirror on the asset store. I know, shocker. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to import the latest version of Mirror. And here it is. And when it comes to a lot of things, I usually import the examples, but I don't really need them. So no examples for me today. Just waiting for that to import. All right. So I have Mirror imported, and right now I don't really have a scene. So first thing I'm going to do is create a new scene. By the way, if you have any questions or anything, definitely feel free to type in the YouTube chat. I also might see it on my Discord, but I'm going to see it faster in the YouTube chat, so just a heads up. All right, so I got a new scene. I'm just going to call this, I guess, gameplay. Doesn't really matter. I should probably put it in my scenes folder though. Get rid of the sample scene, open up gameplay, don't save. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I actually need a network manager, which I don't have. And I'm not going to use it right this moment, so I'm just going to make a placeholder, I suppose. And this is probably in one of the example scenes, but I'm going to show you how to do it from scratch. So what I'm going to do is make a new object, and I'm going to add the network manager, which will add the transport as well, and the transport's already set here in the transport field. Now, if you want to change your transport, you just add it as a component. So let's say I wanted to use telepathy. I'll just add that on as a component, and I'll just drag it into there. I'm going to go ahead and stick with KCP at the moment. Now, it hasn't been very reliable in the past, but they said they've been making improvements on it. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with it for this stream. All right, so next thing I need is the network, or the not the discovery HUD, but the network manager HUD. And what this will do is, I'm just going to show you real quick, is when I hit play, it's going to basically create these buttons so I can start as a client host, a client, or server only. But as mentioned, I'm not actually going to be using this just yet, so I'm going to disable it, but I wanted to show you how to set that up from scratch. Relatively easy, right? So let's go over to my scene, and the first thing I'm going to do is make a very, very, very basic motor script. So first thing I want though is a 3D object, and it's going to be a plane, and I'm just going to make this rather large. And I'm actually going to make a new material. This doesn't really have any impact on any of your coding, but it's just so I can see things more easily. So I'm going to go to create and material, and I'll just call it blue. And I'm just going to just set it to a blue color. All right, now I'm going to make a player object, which is just going to be, for right now, it's just going to be a capsule. Now, I probably will change this a bit later because I need to add some animations, and I'm going to show you how to set up animations. So I will be changing the capsule, not to a model per se, because I don't have any models that I own personally, and I don't want to risk, breaking any copyright laws or anything like that. So I'll just be using primitives for a while here. Now, with the capsule set, as I said, I'm going to make a motor. So the first thing I need to do is, well, I'm going to color it because I said I was going to color it. So the player's colored, now it stands out a little bit better. The next thing I need is a character controller. Now, a lot of you are probably going to use a character controller or a rigid body. The process for client auth is relatively the same. Now, server auth movement is considerably more challenging. I'm not going to cover that in this series. I do have a server auth series, but it's long. It's not something I'm going to cover in addition to this because it'll take up a lot of time. So for now, we're going to use a character controller, and it will be client auth. Right now, we don't have any motors or anything because this is a brand new project. So I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it scripts, and I'm just going to make a new folder for organization's sake, and I will call it units, I suppose. And then I'm going to make a new script, and I will call it motor. Now this is going to be a player motor. Like I said, there's going to be AI later, so I probably will change this at some point. There's a good chance I will adapt this to support AI instead. Now, right now, this is a mono behavior, and mono behaviors is what you're used to for making scripts that you can put on characters. But if you want a script to be networked, then you have to use network behavior. What I mean by a script being networked is being able to access things like syncVar, RPCs, or OnStart client and things like that. And I'll talk about that later. But right now, this is a mono behavior. So we have to actually eventually change this to a network behavior. But to start, I'm going to leave it a mono behavior just to make sure the motor is working. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make update a private void. And I'm just going to do a new method. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Just hijacked my method name there. Okay, so I have a move method, and I need a wake method here. And I need a reference to my character controller because that's how I'm going to move the character. Okay, so now I'm going to do character controller equals get component character controller. And since this is done in awake, it's going to run no matter what. The server, the client, owner, spectators, etc. This is going to run no matter what. There are ways to make code only run on certain clients or server, and I'll be discussing that relatively soon. So what I'm going to do now is in my update method, I'm just going to call move, and in here I'll do float vertical equals input. I'm going to be using the old input system because that's what most people are used to. Get access raw, so it's only going to return -1, 0, or 1. And I'm going to get the vertical value, and I'm going to do the same thing but with horizontal. Okay, so I need to have some move rates and stuff. So I'm going to do private float move rate. I'll just say 3F, so 3 units a second. And this is going to be rotate rate. And I'm not really sure what I want this to be. I'll try 10F. That might be a bit much. But this is how quickly to move. And this is going to be how quickly to rotate. And this is going to actually be a third person controller, just so you can see the animations and stuff. And I know a lot of people probably start with first person, but it doesn't really change how we're going to go about doing things. It's just I'm going to do third person so you can actually see the animations and see what's going on. All right. So now what I'm going to do, actually I'm going to do vector3 next equals new vector3, and I'm going to pass in, I'm not going to actually add any left or right movement. It's going to be back or forward, and it's going to be based entirely on the rotation. So I'm going to do next equals 0F for left and right, so X, 0F for up and down, which is gravity or vertical, and vertical times that delta time. Of course, times move rate as well. This is pretty basic stuff. Like, this isn't anything special. I think I'm going to actually rename this because that's a little confusing. There we go, forward. Now I need to add in the gravity. So next plus equals physics.gravity times dot delta time. So your gravity is usually like 0, -9, 0. So this is going to most likely add on -9 to the next, which will gradually lower the player if they're in the air. So that's all that is. Now I need to also rotate the player, and I never rotate characters this way, so this is probably going to get this wrong. So let's see. I assume I want to do quaternion rot equals quaternion dot Euler new vector3 0F, and if you're rotating, it should be Y. That is, you're gonna have a hard time seeing because it's a capsule, but rotating Y is basically you're facing, and since you can't see it rotating means I'm right, because if I do something like X, you can see it move. So I'm going to add a face on there in a second so you can actually see what's going on. So I'm going to make a Euler out of horizontal times time.delta time times rotate rate and 0F, and I'm actually going to rename this to float rotation. All right, so what we're doing here is basically I'm creating a rotation out of the rotation input of horizontal, which is just like A and W. And you're probably familiar with something like this or whatever you use for your own motor. And I'm going to do transform.rotate. There we go. And you don't actually have to cast it to a Euler apparently. So I'm just gonna cut this vector 3 I made and drop it in there. There we go. And then I'm going to do character controller dot move next. Now the reason I'm going through this kind of quick is because this isn't really mirror related. This is just general Unity stuff, and you might not know it per se, but I would hope to some degree that you're a little familiar with it. Now it's not working because right away I forgot to add the motor to my character. So let's go ahead and do that. It's on there, hitting play. It should drop down, perfect. And if I select my character, you can see that whenever I hold A and D, you can see that the rotation is working. Now the problem is when I hold forward, it goes the same direction every time. That's because I didn't transform the direction. So whoopsies. So I'm gonna just do transform direction. So from local space, I think I need the inverse transform direction, but let's just save this real quick. Give it a quick run. I think, nope, it is that one. Okay, so the rotate rate's kind of slow, and that's why it doesn't really look like it's doing much. So we're gonna bump this up to like 90. There we go. So what that does is it basically just takes world inputs and then converts them to your local facing direction. Now, speaking of facing, this guy has no face, so it's really hard to tell which way it's facing. So let's add a new 3D object onto it. I'm gonna make a cube, and this is a very huge cube. 0.5, 0.5. Yeah, that should be fine. This is its face right there, little block. No, this is not meant to be a clone of a certain game. I know you're thinking it, but no, it's not. It's just, that was just a coincidence. Okay, so I'm gonna color the cube as well using the same material. And now I should be able to see. You can always view the stream afterwards. All right, so now it makes a little more sense. You can tell he's actually moving in the direction he's facing. So if I press back, he goes back. If I press forward, he goes forward, etc. It's working. Great. Yay. All right. Let's see. Just reading a quick comment. Okay. Nothing super important. All right. So let's see what I have on my checklist over here. I got the player motor out of the way, and it looks like what's next on my checklist, if you're looking at the Trello, is, I'm not going to bring it over just because I have other links and stuff up, but it's spawning player from client instance, events, and more. So there's pretty much any infinite number of ways to spawn a player, that, however you want to do it. There's a very common way, and then there's a way that I really like to do. So first of all, to spawn a player or to network spawn an object, it has to have a network identity on it. This is fundamental for an object to actually be spawnable. If you don't have a network identity and you try to network server.spawn an object, you're going to have problems. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that whenever you have a network identity on an object and you hit play, like if it's in your scene, it will be disabled until you join as client or server. So just keep that in mind. That's just how mirror behavior works. So just keep it in mind. Now, let's go back to the network manager, and I'm going to enable it. And I also need to make this a prefab. So I renamed it. Going to make a new folder, prefabs. I'm going to drop my player in there, and I'm going to now just delete it from the scene. And so I have my network manager enabled. I made a prefab out of the object, and I deleted it from the scene. Now, if you look at the network manager, you'll see there's an option down here that says player prefab, and there's an auto create player option. That basically means whenever you join, it will automatically create whatever is in the player prefab for your character. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And when I start a server, you'll notice that it doesn't create the prefab. And that's because the server is not a player, it's the server. Now, if I start as a client, it's not going to work because there's no server running. So for this example, I'm going to run it as host, which is server plus client. So the server is going to run and then the client's going to join. And because the client's joining, it's going to spawn our prefab. And of course, it's going to work as expected. So the motor seems to be working. Now, I'll tell you right now that there is a serious issue with the motor code as far as controlling it or who controls it. I mentioned that it needs to be a network behavior, and right now it's not. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that because you'll probably run into this quite frequently. So let me go to build settings. Just move this on over here. And the resolution is, I don't want it full screen, definitely not. 720 by 480, that should be plenty big. Might even be a little big, but I'll adjust it later if I need to. Close out of that. And I'm going to do a quick build and run. So let's see, let me make a new folder, just call it builds. And now it's building. For some reason it's building on the other window. There we go. This is my first build, so it's going to take a little longer. All right, done. I might have exaggerated that a bit. All right, so I need to actually open up another executable. So let me get two of these open here. I'm just on my other screen. I'm about to open it up. Hey, I'm doing all right. Thank you. So let's see, going to that build. I already have one open. I'm just opening another one. All right. So I'm going to run the editor as server only. And by the way, I highly recommend testing your code as server only and client when possible, because a lot of people fall into the trap where they think their code is working because you're running as client host. And the only reason it's actually working is because the server has the information, and therefore the client has the information because it is a server. But you expect the client to have the information separately, and sometimes that's just not true. So when it's possible, run as a server only and then join clients. All right, so I have one client connected and I'm going to join a, whoa, where did he go? All right, so that was interesting. So I joined another client and two things going on here. One, it's not syncing up. That's not really a big deal. And two, it's controlling both clients, and that's expected. That's part of the thing I said that you'll probably encounter a lot, and that's something we will be covering here. So first of all, we need to make it so it only controls one client, and that's actually really easy to do. Now, this is done, I guess, really only two ways, I suppose. I see it mentioned one way a lot in the mirror server, and it makes me cringe every time because it's wrong. It's not necessarily wrong as in the code will work under certain conditions, but under certain conditions it will fail, and therefore in my book that's wrong. So first thing I'm going to do is, I said this needs to be a network behavior, right? Because I need to access networking stuff. So I'm going to make it network behavior. I'm going to click using mirror. I'm also going to add a namespace just to organize it a little bit. First gear games dot getting started dot units, and I'm not going to really break it down any further than that at this time. I might later, but not right now. So the first issue is that a lot of people do this. Okay, so I only want to move if I'm the local player. So if is local player, then move. Will that fix our problem? Yes, it will. Is it the right way to do it? No, it is not. It is not the right way. stop telling people to do it this way. Okay, so I'm going to explain the difference. The difference between local player and what I'm about to show you, which is has authority. And by the way, these booleans that you're seeing, they're in the inherited class network behavior. Like I don't have anything in here. They're in this class. So to me, this is very confusing just by having like this. So I like to do base dot has authority, which indicates I'm trying to access it from the base class, which is the one up. That's generally good practice to have. Now let's talk about the difference. So has authority is true whenever you have permission to perform actions on that object, and that's something that the server gives you, is that permission. So that's what has authority is. And basically, so we do, okay, if I have permission to make changes on this object, then call the move method, because I only want the person with permissions to move it. Now, what's the difference between has authority and is local player? Well, is local player is only true if it is the local player object. So for example, this is the player prefab. This is what's in the player prefab. Therefore, if I used is local player on this, it would be true and it would work. Now, here's the gotcha. Let's say I spawn another player, or let's say another character for the player, like a pet. Now, if I'm running the is local player checks here instead of the has authority checks, you're not going to have any control over the pet, because yes, you will have authority over the pet, but it's not the local player, because the local player is only what's in this field. Therefore, you're going to run into problems down the road. So don't use is local player for conditions which rely upon ownership. That's not really what it's for. You want to use has authority. So with that said, let's just do another quick build. And now that I have that check-in, it should only work for the owning player. I'm going to take a drink of coffee here real quick. I went so long without drinking my coffee. It's basically water now because it got watered down from the ice. Okay. So let me go ahead and start a new server. And client, I'm going to move it out of the way. And they're still not going to be synced up. That's expected. I'll get to that in a second. Client again. All right, but now whenever I move one client on one screen, you can see it's only moving that one client. So that's working. That was a pretty easy fix, right? I mean, it's one line of code, but it's important that you know what is what. And yes, this is going to be in a playlist afterwards. Someone else asked this, is it going to be publicly available after the stream is over? Yes, at least a week after the entire series is completed. After that, I don't know if it's going to be public after that, but it will be on the tutorial series, or sorry, Patreon tier, which is only $2, and that's like a lifetime pass for all current and future tutorials. So is it going to be uploaded on a playlist? Yes. Is it going to be free? At least up to a week until after the entire series is done. After that, you might have to pay $2 to unlock it if you didn't catch the streams. So with that said, let's go ahead and fix the fact that the two things aren't syncing up. And I just want to clarify again, that's $2 for a lifetime pass. That's not like $2 for every video. It's $2 for all tutorials and future tutorials. All right, so I'm going to add on a network transform, and you might be familiar with this already. This is what's used to synchronize your transform with other players. Now, I said I'm going to be doing client authority because server authority is much more complicated. So I'm going to click client authority, and I will explain the difference here real quick. So client authority basically means that the owning player, so the client, has say as to where their object is. They can move it freely. They can adjust the speed wherever it goes. That's truth, and the server will put it there. Obviously, client authority is very easy to hack, but I would say if you're new to networking, definitely start with client authority, because you're going to bang your head on a wall for a while a really long while trying to get server authority in. I do, like I said, I do have a guide for it, but it's hours of footage. So going back, we're going to use client authority, and then you have your sync interval. This is how often it updates to the server. Now, sometimes I see people do this with like the animator, especially because it might be a little choppy. Is they're like, oh, well, there's a delay or it's choppy, so I'm going to go yoink, bring that all the way down to 0. That basically means it's updating every single frame, and you don't want that. That's going to vastly disrupt your internet and your server, and things are just going to be bad, really, really bad. Imagine trying to like just jam a bunch of stuff down a tube and it doesn't fit, and that's basically what's going on when you do that. So we're going to do 0.1. And as you can see, coding with M is like use Flex Network Transform. Flex Network Transform is my alternative to this. It is vastly superior in every way imaginable. It outperforms anything on the market right now, and I'm not just like trying to pitch it. It actually does. It's better and has more features and everything. But I'm not going to use it because this is for beginners, and this is under the assumption you're using core mirror. So we're going to use Network Transform. So that right there is all we need to synchronize the stuff. So let's go ahead and make a new build. And by the way, to answer your question about parallel sync, yes, it is absolutely useful for multiplayer testing. I strongly recommend it. Basically, it allows you to open up multiple editors. However, if you've noticed, it takes me like 1 second to make a build. So I'm not going to run parallel sync because it'll actually take longer for my editors to update each other than it does if I just make a new build. All right, so we're looking at this right now, and I don't know what client I'm on. Okay, I'm on the client right here on the right side. It's moving, you can see it's updating, and it's looking good. It's working on both clients, right? Now you can see that's a little jittery. This is what I talked about. This is the basic network transform. This is what it does. If you want something better, you're going to have to get a paid product, period, or make your own. Now on the server, it's also jittery. That's fine. The server's intentionally not smoothing it because it doesn't need to. Why does the server need to smooth it if there's no visual? I mean, obviously we can see something now because this is the editor, but in the real world, your server is not going to have an interface, so there's no reason to actually smooth it. So we can see both are working and both are syncing up. That's good. And yeah, I know mine builds faster for now, but even on a project I've been working on for several months, it builds new stuff, like a new executable. As long as I don't change and import like a ton of stuff, it'll make a new build in like 5 seconds maybe. I still do use parallel sync. Don't get me wrong, I still do use it for a lot of things where I know I'm going to be doing like a lot of in and out changes for like debugging, but this computer's just fast. So while it does benefit me in some areas, it's not something I necessarily need right now. All right, let me go look at my Trello because we just knocked out setting up mirror. The player authority has authority checks, and the network transform, which I'm going to bump that up because we covered that a little sooner than I expected. And we got spawning player from client instance, events, and more. So I talked about there's 2 ways to really spawn in your player. Or I mean, there's an infinite number of ways, as I said, but there's 2 very common ways. The first way is to just make the prefab and drop it in here, and that's exactly what I did, and it worked. Fantastic. Okay, now the other way is doing what I call a client instance, and I've been seeing more and more people do this. I think it's finally catching on. I've never seen anyone do this until I recommended it, but I'm glad it's catching on because it's really beneficial. So the client instance, even though slightly, no, I'm not going to cover everything on my Trello today. There's no way I have enough time for that. It's going to be over multiple streams. So one way is, of course, the player prefab. And the other way, which is slightly more difficult, is the client instance. Although we do have a learning opportunity by using a client instance. So we're going to use this. No, I'm not going to be doing everything on the that particular card for the getting started today. That would take hours and hours, and I just don't have that in me. But I will be probably doing it regularly on a daily basis. Not tomorrow, because tomorrow's my partner's day off and we're going to be hanging out and stuff, but I'll probably pick it up the next day, so like Tuesday. But let's go ahead and make that client instance. And this is going to be a networked object. And I'm just going to kind of build it, and I'm going to tell you what it does afterwards. So I'm going to make this into a prefab, and I'll delete it from my hierarchy. And I'm going to set this as the player prefab. So when I hit play now, and I hit server/client, nothing's really there because it spawned the client instance, which is more or less just an empty object, right? So what we need is actually a spawner script of sorts. So let's make a new folder here. I'm going to call it client, and I'm going to call this client instance. So I'm going to open that up real quick. Again, this needs to be a network behavior, and I'm going to just steal this namespace and modify it slightly. I don't know if I put client or clients. Yeah, I meant to put clients. I like to put an S on the end of my namespaces, and you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to at all. But I find that there's less naming conflicts whenever you put an S on the end. So that's what I do out of habit. It's not really breaking anything by doing so. It just kind of goes against the manual, I guess you could say. So I just like to put an S. Now the first thing I need to do is serialize field, and it's not working because I deleted the using Unity. So let me just add that back in. Private network identity player prefab. And I'm gonna set it to null by default. Actually, I'm gonna show you something real quick. This is probably gonna be really helpful to you, or maybe a little helpful to you. I don't know. So whenever it's not going to do it. Maybe I have to do something like this. Give me 1 second. Okay, so there's certain conditions that if you don't set a default value on a serialized field, that'll throw a warning here, and it says something like value not set will always be default, and it's super annoying even if you use it later in your code. All you gotta do to get rid of that is just set the default value to whatever it is. So I just set it to null, and it'll get rid of that warning. It's not popping up right now, but there are conditions that cause it, and I apparently don't know what those are. So tooltip prefab for the player. All right, so very simple. Get rid of the start method here, get rid of the update method. Now I talked about there being certain things, I very briefly mentioned it, I should say, about things in network behavior where you can know where if you're starting as a server or a client, etc. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do override on start server. So basically whenever the server is creating this object, I'm going to run some code. So I'm going to do private void create, or let's just say network spawn player. All right, so whenever the server first runs this script, so what's going to happen is it's going to basically run on the server first, and it's going to call this on start server, and that I'm going to call network spawn player. Yeah, it's a networking tool for Unity. It's probably one of the more common ones right now. It's a server authoritative networking platform, basically. So the difference between this is something very, very, very important that I also see a lot of people. Oh yeah, you might be right. I might have to add it to the script, to the object first. But yeah, this is something that happens a lot. Let's say, and I know I'm jumping ahead here, but let's say I have private void RPC do something. For those that know, a client RPC is a message over the network that's sent from the server that gets called on all clients. Not going to really go into detail about that right now, but let's say under onStart server, I do RPC do something because I want to execute something on this script as soon as it spawns from the server. This isn't going to work. The reason this won't work, it won't matter if it's a target RPC or a regular RPC or client RPC, I mean, is because the client doesn't have this object spawned yet. It just now spawned on the server and it's being sent to the client. And once the client gets that message, they'll spawn it. So you can't send an RPC using OnStart server unless it's being called to like another script that's already spawned and instantiated on the client. So just keep that in mind because I do see a lot of people make that mistake, and it is kind of a tricky gotcha. It's not really in the manual, just something to keep in mind. So the first thing to do with spawning objects, and this is something I see come up very frequently and also done incorrectly very frequently, is you have to first spawn it locally. And this code is on the server, so I'm going to show you something in a second here. I'm going to do game object go, or actually, yeah, I'll just do game object go equals instantiate player prefab, and I'm going to use the position of this client instance. I'm going to do transform.position, and I'm going to do the rotation of it. I'm just going to do actually a quantern.identity, which is basically no rotation. So it's giving me an error because I have a network identity as the prefab when it expects a game object. So I did network identity because I know this is going to be a networked object, and I don't want to accidentally drop in the incorrect prefab. So by adding this, I know it eliminates, or rather reduces the chances of me doing that. I know that it's going to have to require network identity, therefore be an online object. And the reason for that is because I'm going to network spawn it, which next is network server.spawn go and base.connection to client. All right, so to explain real quick what's going on here is first you have to basically instantiate an object locally on the server. You can instantiate it wherever you want. You can access the scripts in that object, like get component, etc., and you can modify the values if you want. You can modify sync vares or just whatever values. It doesn't really matter. And I know I haven't talked about sync vares yet. They're coming later, but just for those that know what they are, you can modify those right after you instantiate it locally. After you're done setting up that object locally, you will call network spawn, passing in the object that you instantiated, so the go here. The next part is the base.connection to client, and this is an optional parameter, so I could just do it like this if I wanted to. The difference is whenever I don't pass in a connection, it's going to spawn it with no owner. Now, there's some terms I like to use, and these are entirely made up terms. There's not really any guidelines to them, I suppose. But I like to use host or client host, which basically means a server, a client also running as a server. I like to use server, which is a server running alone, a client, which is a client running alone, and then I like to use owner and spectator, and these are two you'll see me use a lot. So the owner is basically whoever has authority on the object, and we talked about that briefly in the update using the has authority check. And a spectator is another client which doesn't have authority. So for example, spectator doesn't have authority. And these are just terms that I'll probably use, so just keep them in mind in the future. So what I'm doing here is if you don't specify a connection to give authority to, then no one's going to own it. It will be on the server, and other players will be able to see it, but no one will have ownership of it. No one will have authority of it. So connection to client is basically who we're going to give authority to. And if I hover over it, you can see it's which connection to give authority to, which is the connection to the client. Now, if you try to call base connection to client on a client that's not a host, so not the server and client, it's probably going to be null. And I don't know why you would ever need that in that situation. Just keep that in mind. Now, someone asked, what's the difference between connection to server and connection to client? Well, on the server, connection to server is probably going to be null because you're already connected to the server. You are the connection. But and just like on a client, connection to client is going to be null because you're the client, not the server. So if you want to know what the connection is to the server, you would use base.connection to server from the client. And if you're trying to know the client, you would use base.connection to client from the server. I've never used connection to server, or at least I can't recall using it. Maybe I have in the past, but I don't really remember. So what this is going to do, basically, I know I kind of just rambled about, but this is going to essentially, whenever the server starts, it's going to network spawn the player prefab. And I very briefly mentioned that there is something that we can do to make sure that this only runs on the server. Now, before I show you this, I strongly recommend not using this to make sure things only run on server or client. Rather use them as kind of a sanity check. So with that said, if I do server, like the server attribute above this, and I try to run this from a client, it will throw a warning, and it won't actually let it run. So you're like, oh, that's cool. So why don't I just do that? Well, two reasons. One, it's not really what I call defensive coding. You should pretty much code so everything is plain and clear, and you shouldn't really make assumptions, I guess. Now, that's one reason. It's because it's kind of not clear code. So for example, let's say if I did this under private void start, and I did, if I just did this, now this is going to run on the client and the server, and it's going to throw this warning. You can get rid of the warning, by the way, by using server callback, just basically putting callback at the end of it. But again, I don't recommend it. I strongly encourage you to only use this as a sanity check. But if I do this, it's going to throw the warning because start's going to run on the client and the server. So you do something like if base.isServer, then you can call network spawn player. And it might seem redundant, I know, but trust me, I've been down this road so many times. I very much prefer to do my checks before calling the method, and I only use these as sanity checks to make sure I don't accidentally call it from somewhere else. So with that said, there's also one for client as well, which will make sure it only gets called on the client. And the second reason why I don't recommend using these as to make sure that stuff is only called on the client or server is because depending on your Mirror version and the Unity version, it very well may break. It has happened several times in the past where those attributes have caused errors or they don't behave properly. So again, don't rely on them to only run code on the server or client. Use them as a warning system. That's all they should be used for, in my opinion. I always like to use if statements to filter out what should be run where. So with that said, let's go back to this here, and I have the client instance as the player prefab. I'm going to go ahead and auto create it. Yes, it does not, as Chris said, it does not actually strip your code. It will still leave the code in there, so it's not code stripping. I forgot to add the script to the client instance object. So let's go do that real quick. Yeah, don't think by adding those attributes that it is removing code for the opposite side, because that's not true. I could see how someone would think that though, definitely. All right, so I added a client instance to my client instance prefab, and I'm going to rejoin again. All right, so it made the player. The player is falling to its doom. That's because it fell. It was spawned below the platform or the plane. So the problem with that is the client instance here is like it's below it, I guess. So I'm just gonna raise it above it. I'm gonna do 0, 4, 0. and I'm going to apply all and get rid of it. It didn't actually update it on my prefab, of course not. So 0, 4, 0. Again, I'm modifying the prefab here of the client instance. So if I hit play, and I do have a free tutorial too on stripping stuff from builds. That's in my mirror playlist as well. So you're welcome to check that out. So I have a client instance, which is owned by the player. And I also have a player clone. So as you saw, this is what's being spawned as the quote unquote local player. And this is the actual player object that is being network spawned from the client instance. And that's useful because I guarantee you at one point or another, you're going to need to know how to spawn things over the network. And now you know. Now let's just go back real quick. Remember how I told you that the is local player is bad? So bad. No biscuit. Okay. So I'm going to set it to base is local player. And I'm just going to do this over again real quick. All right. So what's going on? I can't control my player and he's just floating there. That's because it's not the local player. This is the local player. The client instance is the local player because it is the player prefab in the network manager. I have ownership of this player. I have authority. I am the owner of this object, but I can't control it because I used is local player as the check to see whether I can control or not. So that's why you should use if base has authority. Lesson learned. Okay. Maybe they'll stop telling people to use is local player in the mirror server. Maybe you can yell at people every time you see them do it for me. I just gave up. I did for a while, but I just gave up. So let me look at my checklist here and see what we actually got covered. We talked about the network transform has authority. Spawning a player, or it could really be any object, really. This is just how you spawn any object. Just keep in mind that spawning has to be done on the server. So I'm going to put that there for everyone just so you kind of know this has to be done on the server. I also put events and more on my Trello card, and I did not talk about events. And I'm going to need events for the next part, which is initializing camera. Now, there's two ways to initialize the camera, and it's actually, there's one really easy way and there's one slightly harder way. I'm not opposed to the easy way by any means, but I think you should be very well aware of using events because it will help out for other things like the UI and stuff, because you're not going to attach a UI like a health UI to your player, which is what we're about to do with the camera. So I'm going to show you the first way to do the camera. So this is my player prefab. I'm just going to go up to it real quick, and I'm going to just drop the main camera underneath it. Yes, open prefab. I'm actually going to unpack the prefab just because so I can edit more easily. And now let's move the camera up. If I could click right here. There we go. Move the camera up. Move it behind. Just going to kind of tilt it down a little bit. Okay, yeah, that's fine. So why I broke the prefab basically is so that I can align my camera without having to fuss with it. And now I'm going to basically just copy component, delete the player here, and go back into the player prefab. And I'm going to add a new camera. And then I'm just going to paste component values so it aligns the same way. That's all I was doing. I was just making it easy. I think, give me 1 second. Let me finish my thought and I'll answer your question. So what I'm going to do now is, if I have this camera object enabled for every single player, then there's going to be an issue because when a new player comes in, you're going to be shown their camera instead of yours. Because that's just how Unity works. Is if with a standard camera setup, every time a new camera comes in, that becomes your camera, and that's obviously going to be a problem. So I'm going to disable the camera to start, and you'll also notice that the camera is gone from the scene. So there's actually no camera, as you can see here in my game view. Now, very simply, I'm going to make one script, which I might keep it later, I'm not sure. So I'm just gonna make a new script though. I'm gonna call it camera setup, or it doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. And I'm gonna take client instance, just copy the namespace. Normally my namespace would be more organized than this, but I'd rather have at least some organization rather than none. So this is camera setup, and again, this needs to be a network behavior because I'm going to be using one of the callbacks, another callback rather. Serialized field, private, transform, camera object. Object for the camera within the child of this transform. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, right? I'll show you in a second what it does. So let's go to my player real quick, the prefab. And on the main object, I'm going to add my script, my camera setup. Just gonna drop it. There we go. Okay, that was a struggle. I'm gonna drop in the camera object. One thing you might be like, well, the camera is down here, why am I putting the script on the root object? That's just poor organization. Yeah, it is poor organization, you're right. But unfortunately, Mirror only allows you to use network behaviors on the root object, and if you put them as child objects, they won't work. That sucks. That sucks a lot. There's a workaround for it. It's a very, 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 very super easy workaround, and it is part of my tutorials package as well. I won't be covering that here, but it is very easy to do if you're interested in doing that. So like if I wanted to drop it on the camera itself. So we're going to go with vanilla mirror though, and we're just going to put it on the root. So now I'm going to do override OnStartAuthority. Now there's a few different options here. We have OnStart local player, authority, client, and server. We already talked about server. Local player is called if it's a local player being spawned, which we talked about as the client instance. OnStart client. Oh, by the way, I should specify local player will only call if you are the owner of the local player object. So for example, if a client instance spawns for each player, which it will, this will only call on the owning player. The next thing is OnStart client, which will call on all clients regardless if you have ownership or not. So whenever a networked object is spawned, or even if it's in your scene already, then OnStart client is going to call. And lastly, OnStartAuthority is going to call only if you are the owner of that object. So I'm going to actually use OnStartAuthority here. And what I'll do is basically indicating that when this object spawns and I have authority, I'm going to do camera object dot, oops, I actually need to reference the game object, set active true. So all I'm going to do is just set the camera active if I'm the owner of the object. And just to show you that that is working real quick, you can see in the prefab that it is not active. Mirror gave me an error because I hit play mode while I was inside of prefab editing. So I just had to exit the prefab to fix that. And you can see that I dropped in and the camera is active, even though in the prefab it's not. And you can also see that it's following behind my character too because I attached it. So if I actually expand this, you can see it's working. So that's pretty simple, right? That's one way of doing a camera. That's probably the easiest way of doing a camera. And if you want to do it that way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. That's just probably the most common way. Now, I don't know why. I don't like adding cameras to the objects directly. There's no reason you can't do it. Don't get me wrong. There's no reason at all. It's just that's how I like to do it. I just like to have it separate. So with that said, I am going to keep the camera under the child object because that is the most common way to do it. But I'm going to show you something else, and you'll probably be using things like this a lot. So let's go to the client instance. So we need to, I suppose, know when a player spawns, right? I'm going to have to get code from one of my other things because I don't actually remember how I did this off the top of my head. So let me open up another project real quick. Got a lot of projects. I'm just going to move them over here. Nothing really sensitive. It's just I prefer to keep my windows on the other screen. I'm still here. I'm just opening stuff up on my other screen. I can't remember everything that I code in my lifetime, so forgive me. But so I also have like a lot of little snippets and stuff that I use around. Okay, so let's see, and paste. All right. This is obviously not. Oh, this is actually a really good example. Mr. Gadget asked me to show the script templates, and I'm like, well, I don't know if I'm going to have an opportunity to because I don't know where I'm going to use them. But I just realized I have an opportunity to now. So I'm going to do that in a second. So what I'm going to do is basically I have this method called return client instance, and that will let me return the client instance for that player. Now I can do it from the server. If I call it from the server, it'll give me the client instance for whatever player I want. That could be very useful for any number of things. Like if you want the server to update a script for that particular player, you can very, very quickly get the client instance. And if you're a client and you call this method, then it will return the player's client instance, which could also be extremely useful too. And that's what we're going to use it for to start. But right now, as you see this error message and this and whatnot, and those just don't exist. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this instance thing here, and I'm going to do paste public static client instance. So basically, singleton reference to the client instance. Reference value will be for local player. Basically saying that this instance value only exists if it's the local player. So with that said, we just kind of talked about this. Would be a good opportunity to use this for. Override on start local player. Instance equals this. There we go. So now if we need an instance for your client instance as the client, you got it just by using this, because this is the local player object. So I'm not saying local player doesn't have a place whatsoever. Yeah, that was from a project for a client. I'm still working on it actually. It's just, but yeah, that's not mine. I have that in many spots actually. This particular code is just that's the one I happen to pull it from. So this client instance only exists if you are a local player, and this is a use for local player, for example. Now I don't really see much use in using the is local player checks outside of something like this, but yeah, it does have some uses, just not what you always see it used for. And now part of the issue is that one, this network manager doesn't exist, and neither does any of this. Now this might be a little confusing at first because I haven't actually gone over it, but just keep in mind that this value will be the instance to this client instance script for the player that owns it, and that will be useful later, and I'll show you why. And this is a method that you can call from anywhere that will return the client instance, and if called on the server, you can get it for any player, and if called on the client, you can get it for the local player. So that said, this relies on a custom network manager, and right now we're just using the default network manager. So here's where the script templates will come in handy. So I'm going to right click, create, and I have no idea where they put the script templates. I thought they were right here. Am I just missing it? Where are my script templates? Okay, Mirror. Am I blind? Does anyone see them and I just don't? They're there. They are here. Oh, it's because I have a compilation error probably. So let me just go back to that real quick. That might be why. Okay, error gone. Am I just missing it? Am I like completely not able to see properly right now? That's kind of embarrassing. I don't know if it's my fault or Mirror's fault. They're right here though. They're right here. Why isn't it working? I don't know why this isn't working, but you're supposed to be able to right click and there'd be an option for mirror, and they will say mirror, and then you can choose what you want to import. And I basically want a new network manager, but it's not working. So that's cool. I don't know why it's not working. So I'm going to just copy this script right here, the new network manager, and I'm going to drop that in my scripts. And I don't know if that's an issue with mirror or something on my end. Maybe, you know what I didn't do, and I'm actually surprised it's working, is let me actually delete this. Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say, is I did not restart the editor after installing mirror. That might be something you have to do, and I did not do it. So I'm surprised I got that far without restarting the editor, to be honest, because usually you don't get that far. So that was an oversight on my part. Let me restart the editor here and then see if it's, there it is. Great. Okay, network manager. Getting started network manager. You can name them whatever you want, doesn't matter. So I'm going to just drag this up here. There we go. Oh, it says there's already one on there. Remove it. It won't let me remove it because there's a HUD on there. So frustrating. Okay, remove HUD, remove network manager, add my network manager, add the HUD back. Ugh, frustrating. Okay, and now I'd already picked up the transport component that was on here, so I didn't actually have to do that, but now I have my own network manager script, so I'm gonna open that up real quick. And I got that from the script templates, and yes, I had to restart the editor. Now, let's just do this real quick. And let's just do uncomment this. Let me get that code real quick. Okay, so I'm gonna add it at the top here, and it's just in a public region. Region's just used to organize stuff. It's a dictionary type, and it is network connection for the key. So this is where you'd pass in the connection, and it would return this value for you. And this will return your local player objects, basically. And I don't actually think you need this anymore. I think there's another way. Let me just check something real quick. Okay, no, that's not the same thing. There's an option. Here it is, connections. Okay, so that's not the same thing. I just wanted to check something before I potentially, went the hard way around something. So what I'm going to do basically is, this is only populated on the server because the client really doesn't have this information. So all spawn local players only kept on the server, and right now I don't actually have anything for this. So what I have to do is use a network manager to set that value. What I'm going to do here is, I'm doing stuff on my other screen again. So I'm going to go to on server add player, and there's an on server add player and there's an on server disconnect, and you can see that there is They just basically call the base method. So what I'm going to do is, I already have code for this. I'm going to paste it over and I'm going to tell you what it does. Whenever a player disconnects, they're obviously gone from the game. So I'm going to remove that connection from the local player's dictionary. Nothing really fancy there. Now the on server player connect looks like it's a bit of code, right? But it's not really that bad. What I'm going to do is actually go to virtual void on server add player, which is just the actual method as it is on the network manager, the default one. And all I'm going to do is copy this code because I'm overriding it. So I still need this code to run. I just want to do some extra work in it. So basically what I did is I copied this code right here. This is the original code that came with it. And all I'm doing is right before I add player for a connection, I am setting the local player to the object that was spawned for that local player. Because you can see here, it's getting the start position and it's seeing if it should instantiate the player prefab at a start position or whatever, and then it instantiates it. And then I add that object as the local player or the net identity on that object. So keep in mind, what's going on here is the player prefab is, if you go back here, it's what we have set here, which is nothing because I added my own network manager, so I have to drop that back in, but that's what it's referencing. So on server add player is called on the server when a client adds a new player. And basically I'm just storing that player as my local players collection. So that might be a little confusing, so if you have questions, let me know. Then I'm just going to go from here and I'm going to do getting started network manager dot local players dot try get value, etc. So what this does basically is, let's say I did something like this. Let's say if I did private void whatever, if base is server. So this camera setup is on the player. It's not on the local player, which is the client instance. And the client instance can be used for any number of things. It could be used to respawn the player, hold values like names and things like that. It's basically something that doesn't really have a visual representation but exists in the game for the player. And a huge benefit of it is that whenever you want to make a new player, let me just drop in my prefab real quick before I forget. There we go. Let's say you want to spawn a completely different player object, like instead of this guy, you want something else. If you don't use a client instance like this, you have to like make some calls like replace player for prefab, destroy player and things like that. And the whole workflow is kind of annoying and often causes problems with people. They run into issues with it, and I completely understand why. So the benefit of this is by using a client instance is you don't have to jump through all those hoops. You can just destroy the player object on the server using network server.destroy, and then you can just use the client instance to instantiate another one like the way we did. Very simple, very standard workflow. It just doesn't really step outside the norm. You don't have to learn something new for it. It's really easy. So let's say I did want to call a spawner script on my client instance, for example, but I don't know which client instance is for this particular player because this is on the actual player, not the client instance. So I would just do client instance CI equals client instance dot return client instance base dot connection to client, and there we go. I now have a reference to the client instance for this player, and if I have like a respawn script or whatever on it, I can just do whatever I like with that. So that's where that's super handy, and I used correctly, you can do a lot with it. So let's go ahead and close out of this manager script because we don't really need it anymore. We don't need the camera set up. I think I was on events and I got completely sidetracked. Well, I didn't really get sidetracked. It's just kind of something I needed. I was talking about how I prefer to have one camera in the scene rather than one underneath the player. But I am going to use the one underneath the player for simplicity's sake, because that's probably how most you can do it. But I still want to show you how to make use of this client instance, because I know this seems super complicated, and this probably is one of the more complicated bits we're going to be doing, but it's so incredibly useful. So it's really important that you have this information. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a couple static events. I'm going to do, actually, I guess it could just be an action. So let's just do an action. Actions are basically events, just slightly different. I'm not going to talk about the difference because that is like programming things, unrelated. But if you're interested, you can look it up. So static action on, we'll just say on character spawned. And I will, I suppose, pass in a game object. I'm doing this wrong though. Here we go. Dispatched on the owning player when a character is spawned for them. Okay, easy peasy, right? So basically what this is to be used for, whatever you want really, but what we can use it for is initializing UI elements. So let's say I spawn a character in and I want to track its health, right? So if I hook into this particular event here, once I set it up, I can hook into it on the UI element, and I'll receive what object belongs to that player, and then I can grab the health script off from it and I can monitor it, for example, and then show values. That's something that I see a lot of people struggle with, is how to set up UIs, and they try to network the values and stuff, and it doesn't usually end well. Like they'll try to make the canvas like a networked object, and that's a really big issue I see a lot of people run into. So this is actually going to work around it. Now, as I mentioned, this says dispatched on the owning player when a character is spawned for them. We can't actually do this on the server because, let me just change this. On owner character spawn, that way it's a little more clear. We can't do this for the server because it's a static event. So every player would call this on the server, and it wouldn't really line up with the client instance. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go back to my scripts, and I'm going to go to units. Actually, I'm going to go to clients, and I'm going to go to create script. I'm just going to say spawned announcer. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to get a quick drink of water. Alrighty, so I'm going to open this up, and again, I'm going to just copy this namespace thing. All right, so I'm going to do private void announce spawned, and I'm going to do, this has to be a network behavior, again, because it's going to use some of the network callbacks. I'm going to do override OnStartAuthority, because I mentioned that this is only going to dispatch on the owner. So I'm actually going to rename this to owner spawned announcer. I know the names are kind of long and don't really flow very well, but I'm writing this to basically be clear to you what's going on. So I'm going to then call announce spawned whenever this is run for the owner. And here's the really cool part. Client instance CI equals client instance dot return client instance, and I'm not going to pass anything in because I don't have a connection to client, because this is called on the client. So it'd just be null, which is, if you look, is the default connection. So I don't really have to pass anything in. And I'm just going to do go back to my client instance, and I'll public void invoke character spawned game object go, and all this is going to do is basically dispatch this here. So I'm going to do CI dot invoke character spawn game object. So what's going to happen is this script is going to be on the actual character object, and whenever it spawns in, it's going to grab the local player client instance, so the client instance for that player, and it's going to tell it to invoke this method right here, and we're going to do that. So we're going to do on owner character spawn question mark, which basically checks if it's not null, invoke, and we're going to pass in the game object. I would use on client character spawn, but that might suggest that it's for other clients, not the owning client. That's why I went with the owner spawned announcer, which I need to rename the actual method here. All right, so I'm going to show you real quick that is functioning. So I'm going to add that to this. And again, I know it seems like this is like a lot of stuff, but there is a huge amount of flexibility by going this route. It's just so much better. And keep in mind, I've been doing game design for like 6 or 7 years, so I've tried a lot of different things, and ultimately this is what works best for me, and I found the most opportunity using this method. So now to see if it's actually working, let's go ahead and open this up. I'm just going to do debug.log. Got it. All right. Now let's go ahead and hit play and hit host. Oh, no bueno. So we got a problem here. What did I mess up? Null ref exception. I'm going to guess that the client instance is null. I think I know why too. So I'm gonna check real quick though. Let's see. That's in this script here. I think it said line 22. Yeah, so the client instance is returning null, and I think I know why. If I go to the client instance here and I go down to the return client instance, it basically says if the network is server and connection doesn't equal null, run this block, but we're passing in a null connection, so that's not the case. Otherwise, it's going to return the instance, which we set up here in onStart local player. So what's happening basically is that for the local player, the instance isn't being set before the character prefab spawns in. So that's a relatively easy fix. The reason that's happening is because when the server starts, I'm immediately spawning the player, and that's basically creating a raise condition. So what you might do instead is you could wait a frame, or you could wait until the client like picks their character. You could do whatever you want in that manner, but either way, there's a raise condition here because this is actually spawning before the client instance does for the player, which I find kind of unusual. I'm a little surprised that's happening, but at least that's what I think is going on. So I'm going to try something real quick here. I'm just going to make this an enumerator, and I'm going to do yield. Actually, I'm going to do no, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to wait like 3 frames, and then I know this isn't very elegant at all. I'm just going to wait until the end of 3 frames because Mirror processes messages and late updates, so 3 frames I imagine would be enough to send out for this object to spawn before spawning a new object. If you want something more elegant, like I said, it's going to be like a character selection thing or something. Then the player would click their character, and then the server would validate it, and then just call network spawn. Or maybe the client would send a command validating that they're connected, and then they could, that's actually what I'm going to do, because that's way cleaner. This is just a mess. I like to call, when you're using enumerators over the network, I like to call them wait for break, because you have things like wait for next frame or whatever it might be, or wait for time. I like to call them wait for breaks because they tend to break. And you just have to, you don't know when it's going to happen, but it usually happens. So that's my humor in that. But let's just get rid of this and let's add a command, request spawn. All right, so I haven't really talked about remote calls or actions yet. This is one of them. This is what's called a command. So command will always need to be called from the client. The commands are run on the server. So imagine, if you would, if this had a server attribute. Although you don't actually want to add this because this is the client calling this, you just have to keep in mind that this command, because it is a command, is running on the server. So with that said, request a spawn for character. One second. Was just getting another drink of water. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying, Stefan, is, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, is I call that a wait for break situation. I don't like doing it. Maybe in a hack to like do some testing, but I really will not leave something like that in long term. So what I'm going to do is on start local player, I'm going to call command request spawn. And since this is local player, it means I have authority over this object, which means the command will go through. I haven't really talked a whole lot about authority on command, target RPCs, and all that stuff, and I'm not going to in this stream. So for now, just recognize that this is run on the player because they are the local player, and I'm calling it a command, which is basically sending a request to the server, and it's asking that the server will spawn the player. So let's do spawns a character for the player. All right, so let's try this again. Aha, got it. So it looks like I was right. That was a race condition, because right now I got the event, which is basically saying, invoke that action. So let me go back and delete that debug line there. So what's going on, just to recap, is whenever that character spawns in, so that dark blue character you saw, is it's going to retrieve the client instance for it, which is just your local client object. It is on the server too, but in this instance, as you can see, it's retrieving it for the client. And then it's basically saying, okay, to anyone listening to this event, the character has spawned, and it's passing in the character that spawned. This way you can set up your UI elements to pull from that character. Let me go look at I'm gonna do something on my Trello real quick. Fit in remote actions somewhere. I was just adding something to my Trello because I just realized there's nowhere I'm really actually using remote actions, but it's definitely something that needs to be covered. So I'll have to think about that at a later time. Now, going back again, this is again with the camera deal. As I said, I like to have one rolled camera. I'm going to use the underneath camera, etc., etc. But I'm just going to show you the usefulness of having the event, for example. So let's go back to my camera setup script real quick. I'm going to just very temporarily disable this code, and I'm going to make a new camera setup. I'm going to call it world camera setup, and I'm just going to show you this fancy stuff here. So we don't need this. Doesn't actually have to be a network behavior now because it's it's going to be in its own little object inside the world. Don't need that, I don't believe. So what I'm going to do now is I'm still going to keep the camera on the player because I don't want to undo that for you all. You'll probably still use this. I'm still going to keep that here. I'm still going to keep the camera setup script on there. I'm just going to show you an alternative. So I'm going to add a new camera to my scene real quick. So I have a camera here. It doesn't really matter where it's at. And I'm going to add in the world camera setup. So what this is going to do now is under awake, I'm going to do client instance dot on owner character spawned. Come on. Why? It's not making the event for me. Oh, my. Normally when I do that, it automatically makes the event for me. Let me see if I overlooked something. It did not. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, so let me just make it manually. I don't know why my hotkeys aren't working. Normally when you type plus equals and then you press tab, it'll automatically populate this method for you. I don't know why it's not, but it's not. So I'm missing something super obvious here because it's not, it doesn't seem to be liking this either. No, it is. I don't know, maybe my IntelliSense is being dumb right now. I don't know what's going on with that. But basically what I'm doing is, if you aren't familiar with events, is this is a static event inside the client instance, which means I don't need a reference to listen for this event. And what I'm doing is under awake, I'm subscribing to that event. That way, so whenever that event is invoked, which you saw it did earlier, whenever my character was spawned, then it's going to call whatever method follows this. And that would be this one right here. And it takes the parameters that are under the action right here. So game object. So as you can see right here, I have the game object. And whenever you subscribe to an event, let's say when your object is created, you also need to unsubscribe when the object is destroyed. And that's very easily basically done the same, except you change the plus to a minus. If you don't unsubscribe when this object disappears, then you're going to have an issue where it's trying to broadcast to an empty object because this object's gone. You're going to have problems. Now, if the client instance object gets destroyed, which has the event, you don't have to do anything on this side. That basically the references are gone from it because all the references per se are stored in this event. So whenever this object gets destroyed, the references to the event go with it, and you don't really have to worry about it at that time. So with that said, anyway, let's say I have my my event response here is when the character spawns. So if I go back to my prefab real quick, I go to my camera and the offset rotation is 15. I think I'm gonna just hard set the rotation in here real quick just to save a step to 15. And I'm gonna go back to my prefab. The offset's gonna be, we'll just say, I'll just make it a whole number to make it easy. We'll just say 2 and -4. So let me just do that real quick. I know you're probably thinking, well, this is a camera. I don't need to do this for my camera. I'm just going to attach it to the player. But this is less about it being a camera and more about showing you how to use these events. Because in this example, I'm just going to set up a world camera to be aware when my player spawns, and I'm going to follow that player around. but you could use it for anything. You could initialize, you can initialize scene objects using this method. It doesn't have to be networked because this camera is not networked. So it doesn't have to be a networked object. You could initialize scene objects. You can initialize UI elements. Really, it's endless. And I do use this a lot, like a lot. You probably will too. You might not use it right away in your early development of your project, but I suspect you will need it at some point. So that said, let's just say private transform target equals null. Target to follow. All right. So what all I'm going to do basically is I'm going to do target. First, I'm going to do a quick check. If go doesn't equal null, target equals goal, go.transform. There's no reason that this would broadcast null because the owner spawn announcer always passes in the object that was spawned. But just in case, like I said, defensive coding. So if go doesn't equals null, then target equals go, and this is just what we're going to follow basically. So I'm going to do a private void update, and normally I would organize these scripts. I'd put, instead of writing the code directly in update, I would write it in like its own method, but this is just an example. This isn't going to be like a long-term thing. So if target equals null, then return, because there's nothing to follow. So let me think here. I think I need to do transform.rotation equals target.rotation. Transform.position equals target.position plus position offset. Let's see if I actually did that right. Oh, you know what? I'm adjusting the rotation here, but I said that I'm going to hard code it to an angle of 15 down. So this is going to override it, but that's fine. I don't really care. It's just a demo. So got my camera, got the world camera set up. Now if I hit play and I hit host, okay. So the camera is following the object, but the rotation on it is way wrong. That's because it's the offset for it's not correct in the world space. That's because I wrote bad code. It's not that the event's not working, it is working. I just wrote bad code, like the camera's not following it right. So if I were to probably make this like a Cinemachine camera, for example, that does all the fancy code for you. I'm having a total brain fart right now. Anyway, the code is essentially working. The event is working. It's following the player. It's just, this is bad code because it actually needs to be lined up behind the player using their forward and whatnot. So that works. And like I said, I'm kind of getting a little exhausted. Been on for about an hour and a half, a little more than that. So just to recap, everything we covered today is we set up and installed mirror. We made a basic motor, which, I almost forgot. I almost forgot a very, very, very important step. I apologize. This is my bad. So when I was changing this to a network behavior, I also forgot to mention, and this is something a lot of people make a mistake on too, and I actually did myself, is you need to disable the character controller on spectators. You want it active on the owner, which it is by default, but you want it disabled on spectators. Same thing with rigid bodies. If you have a rigid body on a spectator client, you might want to set it to chromatic, or if you're using 2D, you might want to set it to not simulated. So that's very easy to do, actually. I'm just going to do override on start client. If you recall, I said that this will call on all clients whether they have authority or not. So I'm going to do is character controller dot enabled equals base dot has authority. So if I own this object, the character controller is going to be enabled. That's important because not so much with the character controller per se, but with rigid bodies, if they're enabled on spectators as well, then they're going to drift and they're going to fight the network transform. So I'm just going to show you super quick what's going on with that. All right, so I have a build up here. I'm going to run this one as client host, and my camera is completely jacked. So I'm just going to move it over here. Then I'm going to start this as client. And okay, so this is another error message, another step I overlooked. I did mention that there would be some problems along the way because I'm going to be developing this live, but they're not really anything serious. It's just kind of you forget steps. So what that error message basically showed, and I'm gonna actually show you it again. So if you see that in your project, maybe you'll get a hint as to what's going on. So let me just do that super quick. Oh, speaking of super quick, this is Super Bowl today, isn't it? I need to get on that. So let me go and hit play again. That's a client host, that build. And so we got failed to spawn server object. Did you forget to add it to a network manager? Why, yes, I did forget to add it to the network manager. Thank you for asking. So what you want to do is if something's ever not working, please look at the errors and the logs and the warning messages. They are super helpful sometimes. So this one's kind of self-explanatory. It tells me right there what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out, go to my network manager, and registered spawnable prefabs. This is anything you want to spawn at runtime. So what that means basically is under my client instance, I have network spawner.spawn, and it's my player prefab, which, just going back real quick, I'm going to show you. That's just a reference to this player prefab here, which is the blue guy. Now, that is something I'm spawning, so that needs to go in there. You don't have to add objects in here if they are a scene object or if they are the player prefab. Notice that even though client instance is spawning, it's not in there. And if I were to add a network scene object, I wouldn't have to add that in there either. But since the player is none of those, and I am spawning it, I have to add it in there. So let me do another build real quick and try it out. And I don't know if you remember or if you were here or not. Let's see, now it's working. Right now they're stuck on each other. All right, so this is the one I'm controlling now. I'm gonna have to put the camera back because this is super broken. This is the client host player, and I know that because one, it's behind me, and I can see that's clearly behind me here. But two, the objects that are in the game before you will always be at the top of the hierarchy first. One thing I want you to notice though is that code I just added in with the character controller. You can see that it's disabled on this object because I don't own it, but it's enabled on my object because I do own it. So that said, that appears to be working, and I'm going to take this world camera setup script and I'm just going to keep it as is, but I'm going to remove the world camera because I told you I wasn't going to keep that in. And we're going to just go back to the player prefab, open up the camera setup script, and uncomment this so that we're just basically setting the camera active on the player if they're the owner player. That way it will work. But yeah, as I was saying before I got sidetracked again, which happens a lot, I'm sorry. You'll notice that when I tested in client host, it didn't throw any errors and it appeared to be working, right? That's why I always recommend that you try with a separate server and client build, or server and editor, client editor, whatever, just so they're separate. Don't do it as client host when possible, because it will hide problems like that. And it's usually nothing serious, but you never really know. And if you build your whole game around that without testing regularly, using a separate server and client, you might be building onto something that's ultimately broken. So definitely, whenever possible, try to use a separate server and client. All right. So again, I got super sidetracked because I was talking about the what we covered basically. We got the motor where we covered the house authority. I showed you how and why you should disable like character controls on rigid bodies on spectators. I talked about the server and client attribute. I talked very briefly about commands, or aka remote actions, target RPCs, client RPCs. I'm gonna be covering this later. I have to figure out where to fit it in. I'll be covering these in more detail later though. I showed you how to spawn objects right here. You instantiate locally, and then you can network service spawn it, and it has to be in the network manager if it's a spawnable object. I showed you all about the OnStart local players and authority checks versus is local player and things like that. I showed you this fancy code, which honestly isn't really mirror related, and I know that was like a big detour, but it's so incredibly helpful. I strongly advise you try something like this because it is very, very, very useful. I showed you how you can use an event to basically broadcast whenever your character is spawned. That way you can set up objects based on your character like UI elements, and we haven't done that yet, but we will, and we absolutely will be using this, and it's going to work flawlessly. And we're not going to have to use that dreaded find objects of type, because that is pure evil. You've heard me say it, well, maybe you've heard me say in the past, but I have. It's pure evil. Don't use it. I only use that if I am like testing, or if I'm testing, I guess. I really don't like using find object of type because it is expensive and unreliable and just bad. So what else did we cover? We installed Mirror. We talked about how you should restart the editor after installing Mirror. Even if there's no errors thrown, you should restart the editor. And just looking through everything, just want to make sure we didn't miss anything. I think that is about it. That's all I see on my list. I probably got sidetracked a little bit here and there and talked about a few other things as well, but I think that's the gist of today. So, as I said, this series will be streamed publicly. It will be public until the entire series is complete at the very least. And it will be for a week. So that means if there are 10 videos in this series, there's an undetermined amount of videos. That's just an example. But let's say there's 10 videos. They will be public for at least 1 week after I finish the last video. And if I do decide to make them private, they'll be private on my tutorials tier for my Patreon, which is only $2, and that gets you a lifetime pass to all current and future tutorials. There's a Trello link for this particular series in the description of this video, and that you can see all my other tutorials and assets and things like that if you're interested. But yeah, any final questions before I disconnect? Because I am going to go ahead and call it here in a second. There's about a 5 to 10 second delay on the video, so I'm gonna wait about a minute. Tick tock, tick tock. Any questions? Oh, MP, if you're still with us, you asked about ML API, and I meant to answer. I was distracted. My thoughts on ML API is I think it's going to be good. I do think Mirror has a really bad, or sorry, not Mirror. Unity has a really bad track record with starting things and not finishing them. But I think since ML API is already basically done and they only want to improve it, I I think it will. I think it will be released. I think it will be better than Mirror, personally. I definitely think it's going to be better than Mirror, actually. And that's just speculating. I don't know. I don't really have any insight to it. But yeah, I think it'll get done. I think it's going to be awesome. They have a bigger team behind it. They just have more resources. So I'm actually looking forward to seeing that come out. I'm not going to adopt anything into it until it's been out for a little bit, because so much changes early on, and like I said, Unity doesn't have a great track record when actually finishing things they start. So I'm going to wait a little bit beforehand. But yes, I think it'll be great. How do you sync a nav mesh? That's not something I'll be covering in this series, I don't think. But the short answer is there's probably two ways you could do it. You could basically, and this is outside the scope of the series, I suppose, but it's fine, of course. You could basically generate the path. I don't really know the API at the top of my head, but you can generate a nav mesh path without actually having like a nav mesh agent. You can set the start position and a destination, and it'll automatically generate the path for you. And then you could pass in those waypoints to client, server, whatever, and they will follow the same path. The alternative is you could just pass in the same start and end position, and they might follow the same path as long as there's no moving obstacles. Otherwise, if you want it to be exact, you'd probably just have to use like a network transform or something, and just turn off the nav mesh agent for whoever doesn't control it. You mean Steven, do you mean like the OnStart client authority and all that stuff? And if you're one of my supporters on the tutorials tier, I actually do cover this more in depth. I tell you what is good usage of each section. Let me see something real quick. Okay, I don't actually have a tutorial preview for that one. A lot of my tutorials have little short previews as to what's going to cover. I don't actually have one for that one, but I think this is what you're talking about here. Yeah. As far as the exact order at the top of my head, I don't know if onLocal player starts first or after onStart client. I'm not 100% sure on that one, but let me look real quick here. I believe it's definitely awake first. Awake will always call before anything else. Sometimes start will call before the mirror callbacks, but usually it calls after. It's not guaranteed to call after though, but it is guaranteed that when it does call, that everything will be synced up at that time. Yeah, I just answered that. You stepped away at the wrong time. I'm sorry. I'll recap in just a moment though, like super quick. Yeah, it's awake, and its start could be called before or after the overrides. I think it's OnStart client, OnStart authority, and maybe OnStart local player. But again, I'm not 100% sure on the local player one without testing it. I don't really use it that often, and I definitely don't use it in comparison to OnStart client. Like I don't try to use them adjacent to each other. As far as a server end, OnStart server calls, if you're running like a client host, OnStart server will absolutely call before OnStart client 100% of the time. And keep in mind, when OnStart server does call, the object is not yet spawned on the client. That's super important to remember. So don't try and call call methods or RPCs or anything using OnStart server because that won't end well. So MP, I'm just going to recap really quick, the super short condensed version. I think MLAP is going to be better than Mirror. Yes, I do. I think they have a bigger team. They have more resources. They have better funding, and they have a base to work off from that's already pretty solid. So yeah, I think MLAP is going to be good. My only concern is that Mirror, or I keep saying Mirror, Unity has a habit to not finish things they start. So if it's released in like an alpha stage or something, I'm probably not going to play around with it until it's more solidified. But since it is kind of basically already built and they're just taking it, I guess, I think there's a good chance that it will be released. Obviously I don't know when, but yeah. Honestly, Steven, that's one of my paid tutorials, and I'll send you a DM though. I'll send you a DM to the video, because you asked specifically for it, but I'm not going to cover necessarily all content because some of it is from my paid content. So I will cover some paid things, don't get me wrong, and this is a public stream, but that's why I'm only going to be covering some, because like I said, a lifetime pass to everything is only $2. So yeah, but I already answered the question about the stream archiving and all that stuff, so I'm going to type it out real quick, and I think that sounds like that's about it for our questions. So once I type that out, I'm going to go ahead and call it. So give me a moment here to type. When I say it's whether you're a subscriber or not, I guess I mean whether you are a current subscriber or not. Once you pay the $2, you've basically unlocked everything. Sorry, you've unlocked all the tutorials, current and future ones. No, the server authoritative movement streams are supporters only on the project tier. So real quick, I'm going to explain how this works because I reworked my tiers. I had them really inexpensive. It used to be $1 for tutorials, $2 for assets, and $3 for projects. And the projects are super useful. No, the server is not available yet. What's done is basically everything under tutorials, assets, and projects, and they'll have that little pink label that says complete. If it's under considered content, it's not done. If it's under at risk, it's probably never going to get done. But yeah. So basically what happened is my content was really cheap, and I was fine with that. But when I first started, I would say about 5% of people, maybe 10 at most on some months, were doing what I call hit and run. Basically, they were taking everything and unsubscribing immediately, which is fine. That's how it was intended to be. But that number had climbed well over a third of users. So over 33% of people were joining the $3 tier, and they were basically just taking 6+ months of work. Honestly, it's more like a year of work, to be honest. But about 6+ months of part-time work, or a year of part-time work, about 6+ months of full-time work, and they were just taking it all for $3. And as someone who's barely charging anything to begin with, that was devastating. Like I can't keep making stuff for that cheap with people doing that. 5 or 10%, yeah, I could get away with it. 33+%, no, I cannot. So I changed how the tiers work, and they're actually better now for long-term supporters. They're way better now for long-term supporters. They're actually cheaper. So what I did is, instead of the $1, $2, and $3 for tutorials, assets, and projects, it's now $2, $5, and $8. So how that works, basically, and for the tutorial tier, which is $2, if you join that tier, you have lifetime access to tutorials currently and future, and you don't have to stay subscribed if you don't want to. You'll still have access to them. Everything's managed by my website now. And for the assets, if you join the assets tier for $5, for example, you can downgrade immediately after to the updates only tier, and that will keep getting you updates to those assets over time. So you only have to join like the expensive tier once, or I guess expensive, $5 or $8. You only have to join it once, and then you can downgrade to the updates only, which is like $1.25 a month. And also, so that's already cheaper than it was before, because let's say you join the project tier, which is $8, and then you downgrade it to $1.25 a month. Previously, the project tier was $3 every month. So after about 4 months, you're paying less, because it's only $1.25 instead of $3 a month. So that's what I mean by it benefits long-term subscribers better. And also, I was able to add something in by switching it up and running it through my website now. Is I'm now offering lifetime licenses, basically. Well, if you get any of my stuff, it's the license is lifetime per se. Like, I'm not gonna, if you're not a subscriber, you can't suddenly not use what you bought. It doesn't work like that. What I mean by lifetime licenses is, I guess, lifetime updates is a better word. So it varies per tier. I think on assets it's $25. So whether you pay that all at once or over time, whatever it might be, you'll get lifetime updates for assets and whatnot. And that's just another perk, because before I wasn't able to offer that. But now I can. So people that basically contribute a certain amount over time, whether they want, like my content need or whatever, they can get lifetime updates for it now. So essentially, the program or my tiers were redesigned to deter hit and runs, and it has seemingly successfully done so. That's great. And even if they do hit and run, it doesn't really matter because of the higher tiers. And it was also aimed to cost long-term subscribers and reward them as well. It's supposed to cost them less and reward them with more, which is done as well. So I know it might seem like, wow, $5 or $8, etc., up from 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, that's a big jump, but it's actually better. You can stay on the $3 if you want. You can also downgrade to the updates only if you want, and you'll still get updates to content. Depending how long you've been a subscriber to, you might already have lifetime updates for some things, and it should tell you. If it doesn't tell you, it's on the Trello for each Patreon tier explained. I hope that clarifies some things, because I know a lot of people are like really confused about the change and stuff, but it is better for both me and you, believe it or not. All right, well, I'm gonna hop off. This stream's been going about 2 hours, although it's only been about Q&A for the past 15 minutes. If you have questions, please mention me in my Discord. I will miss DMs very frequently. So very frequently I miss DMs. So, and it's because I get a lot, and they basically just disappear and scroll off my screen after a while. So if you do need anything else, please mention me in Discord. Keep in mind, I'm going to take a break because I've been streaming for about 2 hours. I need lunch and all that jazz and whatnot. But tomorrow there won't be a stream because it's Monday, and Monday is my partner's days off. So I take Mondays off as well. But I fully intend to start streaming again on, Tuesday and probably Wednesday as well. So if you're interested, I will be around roughly the same time, probably between 10 and 10:30. I'll start my stream, and that's a.m. in Eastern time. So that was, it's about, well, obviously about 2 hours from now, prior to this time, because duh. But yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for being a supporter as well, Dan. I definitely, truly do appreciate it. I put a lot of time into this stuff, and especially with the number of supporters I do have now. And like I said, it's small amounts, but it does add up and help. And it doesn't really replace my full-time job, but it makes me want to absolutely keep doing it, and I will keep doing it as long as I can. And I don't think it's going to be an issue anytime soon where I can't do it. So yeah, I definitely intend to keep making new stuff. And again, thank you everyone that is a supporter. Thank you for contributing, and have a good rest of your day.